For 8 years, I walked into that building before sunrise, long before anyone noticed the lights turning on or the quiet hum of the servers warming up. I was never introduced at company events. My name rarely appeared on anything except system alerts and late-night logs. Yet every smooth Monday morning, every uninterrupted product launch, every crisis that never reached the boardroom came from hours I spent solving problems no one else could even see. My world was cables, code, and silence. Their world was comfort that depended entirely on the work I carried without complaint. There were weeks when I slept beside my laptop because the system migration they rushed through needed someone awake at impossible hours. There were holidays when my phone rang in the middle of dinner and I answered before the second ring because that was what kept our infrastructure alive. I never asked for applause and I never received any, but the servers stayed online, and to me that was enough. The company kept expanding. The executives kept congratulating themselves. And I kept doing the work that made their confidence look effortless. It is strange how stability becomes invisible. The fewer failures we had, the less anyone understood the weight required to prevent them. People celebrate firefighters, not fireproofing. They praise leaders, not the quiet presence that prevents them from falling. With time, my reliability became something they assumed instead of respected. They noticed my absence in theory, but not my presence in practice. That is the trap of competence. When nothing breaks, people assume nothing requires attention. Then came the moment everything changed. A routine conference trip, a modest hotel bill, a simple expense report for $500. I submitted it the same way I had submitted dozens before. I attached every receipt. I followed every instruction. Nothing about it was unusual except the response it triggered. Instead of approval, I received a message from accounting implying that the amount was unnecessary and that I had failed to consider budget priorities. The claim felt careless, almost absurd, because the same department approved far larger expenses for people who never stayed late enough to shut down the office lights. The situation escalated when a manager forwarded the message to an entire chain of supervisors. Suddenly, I was being asked to justify why I attended the conference at all. Not one of them seemed to remember that I had been specifically requested to go because the software vendor wanted to discuss a critical update. They decided the conversation was irrelevant. They decided the cost was unjustified. And in the middle of that discussion, someone used the phrase a company should never use lightly. They called me non-essential. The word did not sting. It stunned. I had carried the backbone of their operations for nearly a decade, and in one careless thread, they reduced those years to a line item they preferred not to examine. The judgment was instant. The conclusion was easy for them because they did not understand how deeply their systems relied on a single unnoticed person. They wanted a quick explanation. They wanted a confession of wrongdoing. They wanted an apology for an expense that protected their own infrastructure. I gave them none. I did not argue. I watched who was confident enough to be wrong. In every company, there are people whose work takes place far from the spotlight. They do not stand at the front of meetings and they do not speak in dramatic tones. They carry the structure that allows others to feel important. For years, that was my place. I was the person who understood the complicated systems everyone depended on but no one bothered to learn. While executives focused on presentations and forecasts, I focused on the quiet foundation that made those forecasts possible. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. Most employees looked at our servers as silent furniture. They saw blinking lights and storage racks without recognizing the decisions behind each configuration. They never read the documentation I wrote. They never reviewed the diagrams that explained what would happen if a single component failed. These things belonged to a world they believed existed far beneath their level. Yet every department relied on those systems more than they realized. Their confidence came from the fact that nothing collapsed. They thought stability meant simplicity, when in truth it meant someone was constantly evaluating risks they did not know existed. My position required a kind of patience that younger executives rarely understood. They liked impressive language and rapid action. They liked quick results and visible impact. They liked to demonstrate authority through performance. But technology has its own rhythm. Certain failures appear slowly, through hints and patterns that reveal themselves only to someone who has seen enough to recognize them. When you have spent decades working with complex systems, you learn to watch without panic, to act early, and to prevent problems before anyone else notices. This type of work rarely wins applause. Licenses were a perfect example. Most people believed licenses were simple renewals, something an assistant could handle with a few clicks. They did not see the layers hidden behind them. Compliance, user thresholds, audit triggers, contractual obligations that could cost more in a single year than the salary of an entire department. Every time I reviewed those agreements, I saw the same problem. No one else had read them from beginning to end. They had been signed because someone believed the details were unimportant. Yet those details protected the entire company from consequences that could destroy a budget cycle. The risk nobody measured became part of my routine. I tracked usage. I logged exceptions. I documented alerts that I knew would be ignored until they became impossible to dismiss. These tasks were never mentioned in evaluations because the people evaluating my performance did not know the tasks existed. Their focus was on visible output, not the invisible safety net beneath their decisions. Still, I continued because I understood that age brings a sense of responsibility that does not rely on applause. Older professionals know the value of work that prevents disaster rather than celebrates recovery. There were moments when a younger executive would send an email announcing a new initiative that would dramatically change our infrastructure. They liked to speak as if they had discovered innovation. Yet each initiative ignored the simple truth. Systems do not bend to enthusiasm. They bend to understanding. And understanding takes time, discipline, and respect for the people who have protected those systems long enough to see patterns others miss. Experience often looks boring until it is gone. In board meetings, confidence was performed loudly. People spoke quickly, using phrases they believed sounded visionary. But nothing in those conversations mattered if the underlying structure did not hold. I knew that. I also knew they assumed someone else would notice critical details. That someone else was always me. And because nothing ever failed, they believed it all worked effortlessly. I was not invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because my work never failed. The day everything shifted began with an email from the Human Resources Department. It arrived early in the morning, written in the familiar corporate tone that tries to sound warm, but carries no real understanding. The message referred to my expense report and included a series of questions copied from a standard template. I could tell no one in that department knew why I had traveled or what I had done during that trip. They relied entirely on a checklist that measured compliance instead of context. It felt like reading a script that had been used hundreds of times on people whose responsibilities did not resemble mine at all. I responded politely, offering every detail they requested. I attached additional notes and copies of receipts. I explained the purpose of the conference and the technical urgency that required my attendance. Within minutes, another message arrived, again written in the same rehearsed voice. It repeated the previous concerns and asked me to justify the cost once more. Nothing in the reply acknowledged what I had written. Nothing reflected an understanding of the work I had completed. It was clear that the questions came from a system, not from a person. Later that afternoon, my manager forwarded the entire conversation to several supervisors. The thread grew longer, and with each new comment, the discussion drifted further from fact and closer to speculation. Not one supervisor asked a technical question. Not one person examined the reason we had approached the vendor in the first place. They focused entirely on the amount, as if numbers existed without purpose. A few hinted that my request reflected poor judgment. Others implied I had overlooked a policy I had followed for years without issue. No one checked the dependencies that had prompted the conference visit. No one reviewed the documentation I had prepared about the upcoming software changes. They never opened the reports that detailed how certain components were reaching end of life and needed immediate evaluation. They did not realize the conference had given me access to engineers who understood the deeper layers of our infrastructure. They did not grasp that the trip had prevented a potential failure that would have cost far more than the expense they questioned. Their focus remained locked on procedure rather than outcome. What surprised me most was the absence of curiosity. Human Resources had the authority to request explanations, yet no one used that authority to understand anything. They wanted an approved template, not an informed conversation. They examined the surface and ignored everything beneath it. Even when I provided detailed notes, they circled back to the same scripted sentences. The process mattered more than the reality it was meant to evaluate. I watched the discussion evolve like a slow-moving train that had no operator, guided only by rails that did not bend. The final meeting invitation arrived 2 days later. It was called a review session, though the decision had already been made. 3 people from Human Resources appeared on the screen, each reading from printed sheets as if my presence complicated the rhythm they practiced. They repeated concerns, highlighted the cost again, and reminded me that proper stewardship of company resources was a shared responsibility. Not one of them asked how the systems were running. Not one asked about compliance risks. Not one asked about the technical implications of ignoring vendor recommendations. By the end of the conversation, I understood the truth. They did not need information. They needed closure. Procedure had already shaped the outcome, and common sense had no role to play. The meeting concluded with formal language that tried to sound respectful but carried no recognition of the work I had done. They believed they had resolved the situation. They believed they had acted responsibly. When process replaces thinking, consequences get delayed but not removed. Long before the dispute over the expense report, I had spent countless hours buried in documents most people in the company did not even know existed. These documents governed our entire technological world. They dictated how many users could log in, how much data could pass through each system, and how our company would be treated if we crossed any boundary hidden in the fine print. They were the enterprise software licenses, silent contracts that controlled everything from our daily operations to our long-term security. Yet for years, I was the only person who ever opened them. The agreements were dense and written in a language that mixed legal formality with technical complexity. Most executives believed licenses were a simple renewal matter, a routine subscription fee paid each year without further thought. They saw them as a footnote in the budget, something administrative rather than strategic. What they never understood was that every clause carried weight. Usage thresholds limited expansion unless approved in writing. Audit triggers required immediate cooperation if the vendor requested verification. Penalty structures increased dramatically when violations accumulated over time. These were not suggestions. They were binding conditions. Whenever our company added new employees or expanded a department, I checked the usage numbers quietly and adjusted configurations to keep us in compliance. When a new service went live, I confirmed the expected traffic would not violate contractual limits. None of these tasks appeared in performance reviews. They were invisible forms of stewardship that protected the company from exposure. I acted not because anyone asked, but because experience had taught me that systems do not forgive negligence. Compliance never happened on its own. It happened because someone cared enough to look beyond the surface. Years earlier, I had warned leadership that the licenses required active management. I explained that renewal fees were only one part of a much larger picture. The executives thanked me politely and returned to their presentations. They believed my concerns were overly cautious. In their view, nothing catastrophic had ever occurred, so nothing catastrophic could occur. Stability became proof of safety, even though stability resulted from careful oversight they did not notice. It reminded me of people who assume a house remains strong simply because the walls have not yet cracked. The suspense grew slowly over time as usage continued to rise. New initiatives demanded more resources. New hires needed access to systems already stretched thin. I kept adjusting, documenting, and monitoring. I saw the red flags long before they appeared in vendor reports. I understood that we were nearing limits that required renegotiation. I brought this information to my manager on several occasions. Each time the response was the same. They believed we could delay action until the next quarter. They believed the vendor would not enforce anything. They believed assumptions could replace responsibility. After they fired me, the truth began to unfold. Without someone measuring usage and aligning it with contractual terms, the company stepped directly into non-compliance. Every additional login increased exposure. Every overlooked alert pushed them closer to an audit request. The vendor did not need to search hard to find discrepancies. They had years of records showing how our growth outpaced our permitted thresholds. The moment they initiated their review, the company entered a world it had never prepared for. The executives later claimed they had no idea the agreements contained such strict conditions. They insisted no one had explained the risks. They did not understand that the only reason nothing had exploded earlier was because someone had been quietly maintaining order. Losing that person did not erase the obligations. It only removed the protection. They did not fire an employee. They dismissed a gatekeeper. In the days following my dismissal, I received several messages from former colleagues asking if I planned to contact the executives and alert them to the risks they were about to face. Some believed I would step in out of loyalty. Others believed I would speak up out of pride, eager to prove that they had misjudged me. A few assumed I would act from frustration, hoping to show the company that firing me was a mistake. But the truth was far simpler. I did not warn them because my decision had nothing to do with revenge or anger. It came from something older and steadier, the quiet clarity that develops after years of responsibility. There is a moment in every long career when a person understands that silence is not always neglect. It can be a boundary. During my time at the company, I carried duties that reached far beyond the tasks listed in my job description. I protected systems, guarded compliance, prevented losses, and anticipated problems no one else knew existed. I did these things because I was part of the team. The company relied on me, and I honored that reliance. Once my employment ended, that structure disappeared. The responsibility I held did not transfer automatically to my personal life. It belonged to the role, not to me. Older professionals understand this distinction intuitively. When a commitment ends, the obligations tied to that commitment end as well. It does not mean resentment. It does not mean bitterness. It simply means the agreement no longer exists. The company chose to remove me without considering the consequences. In doing so, they reshaped the relationship. They believed they were closing a minor chapter. They did not realize they were reopening every risk I had managed quietly for years. Remaining silent was not an act of punishment. It was an acknowledgement of reality. Once they declared me non-essential, I accepted their decision fully. I could not protect a structure that no longer included me. To warn them would have required me to pretend that my position still held meaning within their hierarchy. It would have meant placing myself in the same invisible role they had dismissed. Boundaries matter, especially when others do not see them. Silence became the only respectful response. There was also a deeper truth. Warning them would not have changed anything. Leadership had reached a point where appearances mattered more than substance. They trusted reports that confirmed their assumptions rather than information that challenged them. They preferred to follow procedures rather than understand systems. Even if I had spoken up, my explanation would have traveled through the same filters that had misjudged the expense report. They would have minimized it. They would have postponed action. They would have believed they knew better. I chose instead to step away with calm intention. I focused on rebuilding my own path, free of the noise that had surrounded my departure. I realized that people who value experience do not panic when circumstances shift. They assess quietly. They act carefully. They know that every transition contains its own education. The company had lessons waiting for them, lessons only real consequences could deliver. I did not need to interfere. Growth rarely arrives through comfort. Looking back, I understand that my silence was not directed at them. It was directed at myself. It reminded me that dignity does not require explanation. Once I walked out of that building, I carried nothing with me except the knowledge of what I had contributed and the certainty that I had fulfilled my role with integrity. The rest no longer belonged to me. Experience teaches you when silence is ethical and when it is necessary. The audit began quietly, long before anyone in leadership realized what was unfolding. The software vendor initiated a routine verification cycle, something that usually passed without incident. This time, however, the system showed unusual activity. The number of active users had doubled since the previous review, yet no record of an updated license agreement appeared in their files. The vendor sent a formal request for clarification. It landed in the company inbox with little ceremony, addressed to a department that did not understand what the inquiry meant. They forwarded it to another team, unaware that the document carried the first signal of a storm building in the background. Within days, the vendor followed up with a more detailed message. Their analysts had compared usage logs with contractual limits and found multiple instances of overdeployment. Login counts exceeded the maximum threshold. Server capacity had expanded without proper approval. Archived data had grown far beyond the permitted range. The company had been operating outside its designated boundaries for years, and the audit had detected every deviation. The findings were not vague. They were specific entries with timestamps proving continuous violation. Leadership gathered for an internal review, and for the first time since my departure, someone opened the license agreements. What they found surprised them. The contracts contained clauses they had never noticed, terms that required proactive management and regular reporting. They realized these agreements were not simple subscriptions, but structured frameworks with escalating consequences. Each missed update carried a fee. Each unauthorized expansion carried an additional charge. When compounded over time, the numbers grew with alarming speed. The legal department requested historical data in an effort to reconstruct compliance records. They expected a few minor gaps. Instead, they uncovered years of unmonitored growth. Projects launched without documentation. Temporary access extended indefinitely. Systems expanded to support new initiatives without corresponding changes to license limits. Every decision that had been made for convenience now reappeared as a financial liability. What leadership once considered harmless improvisation became evidence of long-standing neglect. The vendor requested a formal audit meeting. During this session, they presented a comprehensive timeline of violations. Graphs illustrated how far the company had drifted from its contractual obligations. Tables highlighted every instance of excess usage. The vendor did not raise its voice. It did not need to. The information spoke for itself with the clarity of undeniable fact. The executives sat in silence, confronted by the scale of exposure they had never imagined. They asked whether the situation could be resolved through a simple renewal. The vendor explained that renewal was only one step. Penalties for past violations would be calculated separately. Days later, the first invoice arrived. It was not a warning or a preliminary estimate. It was a formal demand for payment. The amount reflected penalties accumulated over several years, compounded by the use of advanced features that required special authorization. Leadership reviewed the document repeatedly, searching for an error. There was no error. Everything listed matched their own activity logs. The figures were backed by contractual language they had agreed to but never read. The cost exceeded every budget for the upcoming quarter. It overshadowed recent profits and forced the company to reconsider projects they had already announced publicly. Managers whispered among themselves, each trying to understand how such a situation could appear without warning. Some blamed the vendor. Others blamed the current technical team. Eventually, all conversations circled back to the same realization. They had let essential oversight disappear. They assumed compliance happened on its own. They believed nothing would break. Now they faced proof that the gap between assumption and reality can grow until it becomes impossible to ignore. Numbers do not argue. They arrive. The emergency meeting took place on a gray morning when the executives expected routine conversations about growth and forecasts. Instead, they entered a room filled with documents, charts, and unfamiliar technical reports. Legal advisors sat at the far end of the table, already reviewing the penalties the vendor had issued. The atmosphere felt heavy before the first sentence was spoken. Everyone sensed that something had shifted deep inside the company, though no one understood yet how far the damage reached. Those who usually dominated conversations chose instead to sit quietly and study the scattered papers. The head of legal began with a summary that removed any attempt at optimism. The company was in violation of multiple agreements, each carrying significant financial consequences. The penalties were not optional. They were binding instructions triggered automatically by the vendor audit. The legal team had searched for exceptions and discovered none. Every clause that mattered had been ignored or misunderstood over several years. Executives who once displayed effortless confidence stared down at the documents as if seeing their own decisions reflected back with new and unforgiving clarity. The Information Technology Department was asked to explain how usage had grown without proper authorization. The current team shifted uneasily in their seats. They insisted they had inherited the system without clear guidance. They claimed the previous structure lacked documentation. They blamed outdated notes, incomplete records, and confusing configurations. Their voices trembled as they tried to distance themselves from responsibility. The executives grew frustrated, asking again and again why no one had stepped forward earlier. The answers circled without direction, revealing more uncertainty than competence. As the conversation intensified, someone asked whether the previous administrator had left instructions. Suddenly, the room grew still. No one spoke the name of the person who had maintained those systems for years. They mentioned only that the individual who understood the architecture was no longer part of the company. The absence carried weight. It was the first time they acknowledged that critical knowledge had walked out when they approved my dismissal. That single admission changed the tone of the meeting from confusion to realization. One executive leaned back and whispered that the person they had removed might have been the only one who understood the vendor agreements in their entirety. Another added that the dismissed employee had handled compliance without complaint and without recognition. Someone else recalled seeing detailed reports that had never been reviewed. The room fell silent as fragments of memory surfaced. Each recollection added another piece to the picture they had ignored for years. Confidence dissolved not through accusation, but through recognition of their own neglect. The discussion shifted back to financial consequences. The invoice was only the beginning. Additional penalties would follow once the vendor finalized the complete audit. Expansion plans would need to be paused. New hires would be delayed. Entire projects were now at risk. These realizations spread through the room like slow-moving shadows. Leaders who had once spoken boldly now struggled to form sentences. The weight of their decisions felt undeniable. They had assumed the company could function without the quiet presence that had protected them. Now they understood the cost of that assumption. One of the legal advisors closed a folder and addressed the group with calm severity. The advisor explained that the company had placed itself in this position by failing to respect the invisible labor that held their infrastructure together. Silence followed. It was not an ordinary silence born from discomfort. It was a silence shaped by truth, recognition, and a deep awareness that the troubles ahead could not be blamed on anyone but themselves. No one attempted to regain control of the meeting. No one tried to mask the fear settling across the table. That was when they realized the silence was not empty. The first signs of panic did not come from the executives who usually spoke the loudest. They came from the chief technology officer, a man who had built his reputation on appearing unshakable. For years, he presented himself as the visionary leader behind every technical decision. He enjoyed standing before the board and describing innovation with confident gestures while the real work happened quietly beneath him. When the audit report arrived, his certainty began to crack in ways he could not disguise. The numbers did not match the stories he had told. The discrepancies exposed choices he hoped would never resurface. The CTO had relied heavily on shortcuts that made projects appear on schedule. Instead of approving proper upgrades, he instructed teams to route extra users through temporary paths. Instead of negotiating new licenses, he assumed existing terms could handle additional demand. When technical staff raised concerns, he waved them aside. He believed the vendor would never enforce compliance. He believed risk was an academic topic, not a practical threat. His confidence had always been a performance, and until the audit, the performance had never been tested. Several years earlier, I had sent him detailed notes outlining the dangers of unmanaged growth. I warned him that the current trajectory would surpass license thresholds. I explained that continuous expansion without documentation could trigger serious financial consequences. He thanked me politely and moved on to a different conversation. His priority had always been maintaining the appearance of smooth progress. To him, warnings were inconvenient reminders that systems required real stewardship. The absence of immediate failure convinced him that everything was fine. That single belief shaped every decision he made. When the audit findings surfaced, the CTO attempted to control the narrative. He insisted the vendor had misinterpreted the data. He argued that the system reports were incomplete. He claimed the company had not been informed of certain requirements. But as the legal team reviewed each point, his arguments collapsed. The contracts were clear. The violations were documented with precise timestamps. Every attempt to shift responsibility led back to decisions he had personally approved. His composure faded as the room absorbed the truth he could no longer hide. The executives began asking direct questions. Why had usage grown beyond authorized capacity? Why had no one initiated a renegotiation? Why had alerts been dismissed or ignored? Each question stripped away another layer of his confidence. He realized he could not pretend ignorance. He had seen the warnings and chosen to focus on optics rather than accuracy. His decisions created the vulnerabilities that now threatened the company. Leaders who remain silent in the face of rising risk often believe silence protects them. In reality, it accumulates consequence. As the meeting progressed, the CTO's panic became visible in the smallest gestures. He tapped his pen repeatedly. He avoided eye contact. He shuffled papers as if searching for an explanation hidden between the pages. The realization that he no longer controlled the story settled on him with undeniable weight. Those who praised him for years now questioned his competence. Those who applauded his presentations now examined his oversights. His authority, once unquestioned, felt fragile for the first time. When the audit costs were presented, the CTO understood that his decisions would no longer remain buried in technical files. They would become part of board records, financial reports, and internal reviews. Accountability, long postponed, had arrived. He faced the truth many leaders learned too late. Influence does not eliminate responsibility. Titles do not shield flaws. Authority magnifies both success and failure. Power reveals itself fastest when it is cornered. The final invoice arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, delivered through a secure channel that only a few members of leadership had access to. There was no warning message attached, no explanation, no attempt at negotiation. It appeared as a single document with precise calculations, clear contractual references, and a total that forced the executives to sit down before reading the rest. For years, they had ignored the growing signals hidden inside their infrastructure. Now the cost of those choices stood in front of them with the unmistakable authority of arithmetic. The number was so far beyond their expectations that for several moments no one spoke. The legal team reviewed the invoice first. Their faces changed shape in slow motion as they reached the final page. They checked the figures again, then checked them a third time, hoping that repetition would reveal some overlooked detail that could soften the impact. Nothing changed. The penalties covered years of unreported usage. Additional charges reflected unauthorized expansions. Compounded fees applied to every period of noncompliance. Each line was tied to a clause they had agreed to long ago. They realized that the vendor had followed the contract with absolute precision. There was no room to dispute the findings. The chief financial officer was called into the room and handed the document. He read it silently, and with each section his posture sank lower. The company had planned a series of investments for the next 2 quarters. Those plans evaporated the moment he reached the total. $12 million represented more than a budget adjustment. It represented a shift in the entire direction of the organization. They could no longer pretend the audit was a minor inconvenience. It was a structural crisis that demanded an immediate and unified response. The board assembled for an emergency session that afternoon. They arrived expecting to review a challenging situation. They did not expect to confront the largest unplanned expense in the history of the company. Some board members believed at first that the number must be an error. The legal team explained that the vendor had supplied detailed evidence. The finance team confirmed that the activity logs matched every claim. The technology department admitted that the usage levels recorded by the vendor were consistent with internal systems. Slowly, disbelief gave way to recognition. The company had walked into this crisis willingly, step by step, over several years. There was no dramatic argument. There was no shouting. The severity of the moment erased any desire for theatrics. The board members studied the reports with the quiet concentration of people who understood that emotion would not change anything. The chief executive officer asked whether any part of the invoice could be negotiated. Legal advisors explained that the only negotiable elements were the payment schedule. The penalties themselves were final. They had been triggered by automated conditions in the contract. The vendor had simply followed the rules the company had ignored. Financial projections for the year were recalculated on the spot. Planned expansions were halted. Hiring initiatives were suspended. New products were placed on indefinite hold. The company had no choice but to shift resources toward resolving the consequences of decisions that once seemed harmless. The executives understood that this crisis did not arrive suddenly. It had been building quietly beneath the surface while they focused on presentations, speeches, and projections that now felt painfully detached from reality. In the end, the room fell silent again as leadership absorbed a final truth. The cost was not just financial. It reflected years of dismissed warnings and overlooked responsibilities. The invoice did not punish them. It revealed them. At that scale, pride becomes expensive. The board convened again 1 week after the 12 million invoice reshaped every projection they had prepared for the year. This time the meeting took place behind closed doors, without advisors or department heads, and certainly without me. They gathered in a room designed for confidence, a room where important decisions were usually made with pride and ceremony. Yet on that day, the atmosphere felt different. No one entered with the ease of a person in control. They entered carrying the weight of consequences that no one could deflect. The long table that once symbolized authority now felt like a witness to their collective oversight. Reports had circulated throughout the company, creating an unspoken agreement that someone needed to be held responsible. The board members reviewed every timeline, approval, and communication connected to the expanding usage of the licensed software. They examined the choices that had allowed the company to drift so far from compliance. When they compared the technical records with the executive decisions, one pattern appeared repeatedly. Every critical point of neglect traced back to the technology department. More specifically, it traced back to the leader who had dismissed warnings and relied on assumptions. The chief technology officer entered the room with visible tension. His usually confident stride had lost its rhythm. He took his seat and avoided looking directly at the finance documents placed in front of him. The board members began with calm questions. They asked why no compliance review had been initiated. They asked why past concerns were not addressed. They asked why no one had been assigned to monitor usage thresholds after my departure. With each question, the CTO felt pressure grow around him, not through anger, but through clarity. These were not personal attacks. They were facts presented without room for interpretation. The CTO attempted to defend his decisions, claiming limited resources and competing priorities. He spoke about the need to deliver rapid innovation and the challenge of balancing ambition with operational constraints. He insisted that he trusted his teams. He insisted that the vendor agreements were more complicated than they appeared. But as he spoke, the board members compared his explanations with the data. They realized that the issue was not complexity. It was neglect. He had chosen to ignore structural responsibilities because they did not fit the narrative he preferred to present. One board member asked a question that ended the discussion. Who had managed compliance before his oversight took effect? The room became still. No one used my name, yet everyone understood the reference. They remembered the reports I used to prepare. They remembered the stability that existed when someone quietly tracked every requirement. They remembered that nothing had failed while those tasks were completed without recognition. The silence that followed carried an uncomfortable truth. The crisis did not begin when the audit arrived. It began when they removed the person who had prevented the crisis. The board excused the CTO from the room. They deliberated for several minutes, though the outcome had become obvious long before the vote. Leadership required accountability, and accountability required change. When the CTO returned, he was informed that his tenure had ended. The decision was recorded in writing and sealed with formality. No anger. No spectacle, only acknowledgement that his role could no longer protect the company. Outside the building, life continued without interruption. Employees carried coffee cups. Phones rang. Meetings proceeded. No one knew that a chapter had closed behind a quiet door. And I remained far away from all of it, living my life with calm detachment, unaware of the exact hour when the decision was made, but fully aware that this moment would eventually arrive. I was not there when he fired me. I was not there when they fired him either. News of the leadership change moved quietly through the company, carried in lowered voices and brief conversations that stopped the moment someone entered the room. It did not take long before former colleagues began reaching out to me. At first, the messages were casual greetings meant to appear friendly. Some claimed they only wanted to know how I was doing. Others pretended to check in out of concern. But beneath every word there was a shared intent. They wanted information. They wanted reassurance. They wanted access to something that no longer belonged to them. The tone revealed more than the message ever could. A few days later, the communication became more direct. Someone from Human Resources contacted me with a formal request. The message was carefully written, filled with polite phrases and softened language. They hoped I would consider a brief conversation to help clarify historical processes. They emphasized that my insight could support the current transition. They framed it as an opportunity to contribute to the stability of the organization. The wording attempted to honor my experience, though it came from the same department that once questioned a $500 expense with complete disregard for context. I read the message slowly and felt no anger. What I felt instead was recognition. They had expected stability to continue without effort. When the consequences appeared, they looked for the one person who had always handled the unseen work. Their urgency did not come from appreciation. It came from need. They believed that once the crisis passed, everything would return to the old pattern where I remained invisible yet essential. But that pattern no longer existed. They had chosen to remove it. My role, my access, and my obligations had ended the day they dismissed me. The company then asked whether I might consider a short-term consulting arrangement. They presented it as a professional opportunity. They explained that my knowledge could prevent further complications. They insisted the request was not an attempt to undo the past, but to create a cooperative future. Yet every part of the offer revealed the same truth. They needed guidance because they had not valued it when they had it. They wanted clarity without accepting responsibility. They wanted to borrow experience temporarily without acknowledging the cost of losing it. I thought carefully before responding. Older professionals understand that decisions made during emotional moments rarely age well. I allowed myself time to reflect. When I finally answered, my reply was simple and direct. I thanked them for thinking of me. I expressed appreciation for the invitation. Then I declined. Not out of resentment. Not out of pride. I declined because the work they wanted required a foundation of trust that no longer existed. My expertise had once belonged to the company because they employed me. Now it belonged only to me. Some colleagues tried again, hoping I might change my mind. They suggested the consulting offer could be adjusted. They asked whether a different structure would appeal more. They hinted that the compensation could be increased. Their persistence did not pressure me. It clarified everything. They were no longer speaking to the person they dismissed. They were speaking to the person they finally understood they had depended on. But their understanding arrived too late to matter. Walking away did not feel triumphant. It felt appropriate. There are moments in life when maturity requires stepping back even when others want you to step forward. Boundaries are not walls. They are signals. They remind us who we are and what we will no longer accept. My value did not depend on whether they recognized it. My relevance did not disappear when they removed my access. The truth was far simpler. Experience does not chase relevance. It defines terms. Life grew noticeably quieter once I stepped away from the company. The noise that had filled my days for years faded slowly, and what remained felt almost unfamiliar. There were no sudden alerts pulling me from sleep. There were no rushed requests demanding immediate solutions. The absence of constant urgency revealed a space I had forgotten existed. It was not simply freedom from work. It was the rediscovery of control, a calm sense that my time now belonged entirely to me. I began each morning without tension in my shoulders, without thoughts of what might fail if I did not intervene fast enough. That change alone felt like a form of recovery. With distance came clarity. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped by the need to justify my contribution. Every time I prevented a system failure, no one saw the effort behind it. Every time I managed compliance, the stability looked effortless to those who never read the agreements. I had been explaining my value through tasks that were invisible by design. Leaving the company allowed me to release the habit of proving what experience already confirmed. I no longer needed recognition from people who chose not to understand the work that protected them. My days took on a slower rhythm. I began choosing what deserved my attention rather than reacting to constant demands. I returned to small pleasures that had been pushed aside. Coffee enjoyed without glancing at email. Walks taken without mentally reviewing technical risks. Conversations held with full presence instead of half focus. These simple moments revealed something important. Peace is not created by escaping responsibility. Peace is created by aligning responsibility with respect. When that respect disappears, imbalance replaces purpose. Friends noticed the shift before I did. They said my voice sounded different. Lighter. Steadier. They reminded me that long careers often require a period of quiet after years of carrying unspoken weight. Their words stayed with me because they recognized something I had struggled to admit. I had spent so long supporting a structure that never supported me that I forgot what a balanced life felt like. The absence of pressure allowed me to see my own competence with neutrality rather than exhaustion. There were moments when colleagues attempted to pull me back into their world. They sent updates about ongoing challenges or stories about adjustments made after the audit. I listened politely but felt no desire to return. The distance revealed what I had missed while I was inside the system. I had been solving problems that did not deserve my energy. I had been working to protect people who did not value the protection. Once I understood this, stepping back no longer felt like loss. It felt like alignment with my own dignity. I became more selective about my professional choices. I accepted work only when the environment respected clarity, preparation, and genuine understanding. I no longer entertained roles built on constant crisis or superficial leadership. Experience taught me that competence deserves environments where it can breathe rather than environments where it is consumed without acknowledgement. This shift was not about pride. It was about preservation. Life becomes fuller when you choose spaces that appreciate depth rather than appearances. The most surprising change was internal. I discovered that success does not always announce itself. Sometimes success arrives quietly, in the form of a door closing behind you while another opens in front of you without noise or ceremony. I had not won loudly. I had exited clean. And in that clean exit, I found a new form of strength, one that did not depend on proving anything to anyone. It came from accepting that my value was never defined by their understanding. The goal was never revenge. It was alignment. If you have spent decades in the workplace, you already understand truths that younger professionals discover only after mistakes reshape their confidence. You know that real competence is quiet. You know that mastery grows in the background, through years of repetition, observation, and responsibility. You know that the most valuable people in any organization are not the ones who speak the most, but the ones who prevent the most from falling apart. I learned this long before the company dismissed me. I understood it even more clearly once they faced the consequences of decisions made without understanding. Professionals over 50 carry a form of knowledge that cannot be taught in a seminar. It is earned through situations where patience mattered more than speed and judgment mattered more than enthusiasm. With time, you recognize that your value does not come from proving anything. Your value comes from the fact that your work stands even when others doubt it. But in a world that often celebrates appearance over substance, it becomes important to protect that value with intention. Do not perform competence. Document it. Let your work speak through clear records, organized evidence, and consistent accountability. Many experienced workers fall into the habit of saving organizations quietly. They fix recurring problems without recognition. They prevent disasters without applause. They shield teams from consequences created by ambition without structure. With age comes the temptation to continue doing this out of loyalty. Yet loyalty without boundaries becomes exploitation. It is not your job to hold an entire company on your shoulders. It is your job to operate with integrity and to make sure that your contribution is treated with respect. Protect your work. Protect your clarity. Protect the history that shows what you have built. There is another lesson that only experience can teach. Know when to step back. Not out of defeat. Not out of bitterness. Step back when your presence is used rather than appreciated. Step back when your guidance is ignored repeatedly. Step back when silence reveals more than explanation ever could. Leaving does not diminish your value. Leaving reminds the world that stability does not happen on its own. It requires someone who sees risks before anyone else notices the warning signs. When I left the company, I did not realize how much freedom waited on the other side. Age has a way of revealing what truly matters. You understand that peace is not a luxury. It is a decision. You understand that career transitions do not end your relevance. They redefine it. Professionals over 50 often underestimate the strength they carry. They forget that entire generations have benefited from the systems they built. They forget that wisdom is not outdated. It is simply quiet until someone needs it. If you are listening to this and you have spent years feeling unseen, remember this. The work you have done carries weight that silence cannot erase. The people who overlook it are not qualified to measure it. Your value does not disappear because someone younger fails to recognize it. Your contribution does not shrink because leadership misunderstands it. Experience does not fade. It deepens. It becomes a foundation you can stand on even when others pretend not to see the structure beneath them. My story is not about revenge. It is about clarity. It is about understanding that a career is not judged by the final chapter, but by the consistency of the chapters that came before. And if there is one message I would leave for every professional who has spent a lifetime building, protecting, and sustaining the work of others, it is this. Sometimes the most expensive mistake a company makes is assuming the quiet person has nothing left to say.